Most of my work in foreign countries. I lived for 4 years in Mexico, and I lived for 7 years in Nicaragua. I went to Mexico in 1977. Oh. Lived there until 1981, came here and lived in New York for a couple of years working on the desk of United Press International. And then I went to Nicaragua to live in 1983 to be based there. I eventually became Newsweek magazine's contract photographer in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the vast majority of my work has been done overseas. I moved from being a print journalist, a correspondent, to being a visual journalist, a photographer for Newsweek magazine, and now I make documentary films, and I teach at American University in Washington, D.C. Journalism has been really good to me, and it's time for me to give back to the craft that's been so good to me. And particularly now, I think journalism and journalists are more important than ever. This country needs the craft and the people who practice the craft legitimately like it never has needed them before. So what I'm going to show you this evening is the parts of the pilot episode of a documentary series, what I hope will be a documentary series. And I shot this film in Mexico 2 years ago with just myself and a graduate student of mine, a very, very talented graduate student, a guy by the name of Matthew Chipolone. And he's not the typical graduate student. He's a little bit older. When we shot the film, he was, I think, 37 years old. We went to Mexico during spring break of 2017, and we worked for 10 days in Mexico City, the capital. We went to the border area, the border city of Nogales, and we went to the southern state of Guerrero, which is a very, very violent place. As you probably know, Mexico is in the middle of a vicious drug war. Some people call it, I think more accurately, an insurgency, because once all the peaceful means of change have been exhausted, when peaceful opposition to a government becomes criminalized, and when the response to that peaceful opposition is militarized, when all the peaceful avenues of change are exhausted, then you have violence. And that's what's happened to a lot of people. That's the analysis of a lot of people in Mexico. So I went to Mexico to do the first of what I hope will be a series of the hubs of journalism. Foreign correspondence in the last several decades has evolved tremendously. It used to be we had family-owned newspapers all across the United States. They had their own foreign correspondents. There were different newspaper chains. There were magazines like the magazine that I used to work for, Newsweek magazine, that had correspondents and photographers all over the globe. That's changed when big corporations came to the conclusion that journalism could be a moneymaker. Newspapers could make money. There was lots of consolidation. What's happened in the last couple of decades is that we've seen the closure of foreign bureaus all around the world. We've seen staff foreign correspondents losing their jobs. And we've seen the emergence of freelance foreign correspondents filling this void left by mainstream media retreating from foreign news coverage. No one here in this country, or very, very few people, really understand this phenomenon and why it's so important. What's happening now is we're being fed information from vital places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Africa, Asia, Latin America, where I spent so much of my professional life, by freelancers. And a lot of them are local hires. A lot of them are young men and women like the people that I teach at American University. I have a course that I created for American University. It's called Foreign Correspondence. And it's based on the foundation of a course that I took in Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, in the 1970s, and the course launched my career as a foreign correspondent. So I teach young people to be foreign correspondents, freelance foreign correspondents, and they go out into these countries, and sometimes they have very good results, sometimes they have very bad results. I just came from an all-day conference of the ACOS Foundation. It's an acronym, ACOS, and it means a culture of safety for freelancers, a culture of safety, ACOS. And the all-day conference it included journalists, it included people who manage newspapers, people who teach journalism, what to do about the crisis with freelance foreign correspondence. Present at today's meeting was Diane Foley. Everybody remembers James Foley, the young man and the father of a young man whose last name is Sotloff. Can't remember his first name right now. But these were the two men who were killed online. They're decapitated by members of ISIS who captured them and held them for a while and then killed them both, executed them on the internet. So my series is about these what I call these hubs of foreign correspondence. When I moved to Mexico in 1977, there were scores of journalists, both staff and freelance, who lived and worked in Mexico City. But they covered more than just Mexico. They covered all of Mexico. They covered Central America, which includes Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Belize, Panama, Costa Rica, all of those countries, and the Caribbean, which includes, of course, Cuba, the Bahamas, all of these lovely Caribbean islands. And so that was our area of coverage. We covered all of those countries, and we had local freelancers in those countries that fed us information. Part of my job was to be in Mexico, translate their dispatches from Spanish to English, and then send their dispatches and their pictures to UPI headquarters here in Manhattan. And Mexico City was a hub because it was connected with all of those countries in that region by language, by culture, by trade, by economics, by refugees, by opposition forces. Nothing happened, especially in Central America. During the 70s and 80s when I lived there, nothing happened in one country that didn't have a ripple effect in the nearby countries. Whether it was war, whether it was illegal contraband, whether it was refugees, whether it was cocaine, all of these countries were connected. So my job, aside from teaching at American University, I've taken on this task of doing these documentaries about these hubs and how freelance journalists work. These people are doing the heavy lifting now of foreign correspondence. And I think it's important that we understand how these people do their jobs. We live in a country that believes that journalism and a free press are the fourth pillar of a democratic society. You have the executive branch, you have the legislative branch, you have the judicial branch, and you have the press, a free press, that in theory keeps its eye on and performs checks and balances on all the rest of those institutions. And you see that if you watch CNN, if you watch Fox News, that's happening right now. And this administration is, and I apologize if I offend anybody's political beliefs, but this administration is basically at war with the free press. And every time he calls journalists the enemy of the people and fake news, that actually empowers people in some of these countries, like Duterte in the Philippines, like Ortega in Nicaragua, like in Brazil, in Turkey, it gives them license to attack their own journalists. In Mexico, and I point that out in my film, in Mexico, in the past 10 years, almost 200,000 people have been killed in the drug war. 100 journalists have been killed. At least 25 are missing and they're presumed dead. In the same period, a 10-year span, in Vietnam, all-out war, 59,000 American soldiers were killed. In the same period, in Mexico, 200,000 people, most of them civilians, were killed. So, I mean, the death toll is just extraordinary. And labor union leaders, journalists, activists of any kind, walk around with targets on their backs, basically. And they never know where that thin red line is between life and continuing to practice their craft and death. So, what I'm trying to do is to bring some understanding about how these men and women work. Some of them are my students that I send to these countries, but I encourage them to go to these countries and do their jobs. It's important to me that people understand what they're doing and the risks they are taking. Right? And not all of them are covering war, and I would never encourage students to go and cover conflict, like I did for many years. But I won't deter them from doing that either. I just want them to be prepared no matter what they do. Okay? So this is what I'm going to show you is part of the pieces of this pilot, what I hope will be a pilot to a series. I want to go to Thailand next, or Brazil, or Turkey to do the next one. I want to go to Nairobi, Kenya eventually. I want to go to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil eventually. I want to go to where these hubs, where journalists, both staff and freelancers, congregate, and where they cover not just the country where they're based, but in a region of the world, so that we can be back, so we know who these young people are and we can support them. The meeting that I was at today is all about how do we support these young people out there, from getting hurt. How do we ensure that they get paid on time? How do we ensure that when they get into trouble, they get help? So I'm part of this movement now that's coalescing around freelance foreign correspondence. I'm afraid I'm going to have to disrupt you a little bit so that we can move here and see the television screen. Mexico is the first place where I wanted to go and shoot the pilot because I lived there for 4 years. I still have friends there. That's where I really started out, and it's relatively cheap to go there. My student and I went there for 10 days, and it's an awful lot cheaper than going to a place like Thailand or Cairo. So here we go. And again, we'll watch pieces of this. In the first piece, I'll show you about 8 minutes of it, and you'll get a sense of what the thing is about and who are the key players. The first person you'll see is a freelance foreign correspondent. He works a lot for the New York Times and for Time Magazine. He's an authority on the narcotraficantes, the drug traffickers in Mexico. He's written one of the most important books on narcotráfico and he's in Mexico, and he's written a second book about the whole drug trafficking network in the Western Hemisphere, Central, South America, Mexico, up into the United States. And he tells us at one point during the film, we probably won't get to that, but this business of the narcos, they traffic much more than just drugs and people. It's more than just an international mafia kind of organization. It's more like warlords in a place like Afghanistan. These guys, they traffic billions of dollars of stolen petroleum. They traffic billions of dollars of minerals like gold. They traffic human beings. They traffic cocaine. They'll traffic anything that they can. And they've completely infected every level of life in Mexico. It used to be that the cartels had to pay the local mayors so that the local mayors would keep the police off of their backs so that these guys could do their business in peace, right? Now, the mayors have to pay the narcos to, number one, stay alive, and number two, to get appointed or elected to be mayors. If they don't, then they and their families get killed, and the next person who aspires to be mayor won't be elected. That's how much power they have. Yes?
So it's interesting in India.
Ah.
What has happened is that earlier politicians used criminals to get elected, and now criminals run for office themselves. So a lot of people in parliament and in state legislative assemblies, basically mafia dons, who have loyalists who vote for them. So if this is what's happening in Mexico, then the next stage is they won't even need the mayor; they themselves will get elected.
Could be. Could be. We live in difficult times. So let's see. It's a long, dark walk under the streets of Nogales, Mexico. These drainage tunnels prevent seasonal rains from flooding the streets above. They also allow human and drug traffickers underground access from Mexico into the United States. It's not the kind of place you want to go for an afternoon stroll, not without a police escort and lots of guns.
Cuando desde este punto hasta la take drugs into the United States. Have someone go down that side. Now this concrete, you can see was like poured in by the Border Patrol. The BP there stands for Border Patrol. They recognise the Border Patrol founders. So they poured in concrete from the United States, like just poured it down, and it ended up filled up here.
And they had to have some cooperation here from the Mexican authorities, I think, because apparently they put a piece of something here to block this concrete. They came down to stop it. So there's coordination between the two countries.
Young Grillo is a freelance journalist working for outlets including the New York Times and Time magazine. He's not staff. Freelance means he proposes stories to media outlets and they either buy his work or not. Or an outlet contacts him to request his coverage on some issue or event. Grillo is one member of a new generation of freelance journalists increasingly filling the void left by mainstream media retreating from news coverage abroad. As corporate media close bureaus and cut staff around the world, it's freelancers who take their place.
Okay, so this is a drainage tunnel from the United States that goes into Mexico. Now the issue is you have in this area one city which crosses the border. However, drug smugglers would use these to smuggle drugs into the United States. It smells pretty funky down here right now. You start getting to this area, which is also used for sewage.
Grillo has covered drug trafficking in Mexico for 15 years, but even he didn't fully understand the impact of this border on the lives of people living in its shadow. We'll follow him as he reveals those hidden stories on both sides of this frontier.
Well, you can see a pretty long tunnel going right, this is going right to the United States. So you can see this is something else, and it's big, you can see kind of holes in there, you can see this is something else, which will be a way to potentially move drugs.
Photojournalist Patrick Tomola is based in Venice, Italy. He's making photos which he'll try to sell to the New York Times. Like Grillo, Tomola is a dedicated, determined, and tech-savvy professional putting everything on the line to live life his way. His last job with Grillo was this story on El Salvador for Time magazine.
You've got two layers of gates, and you've got a lighted area, and you've got obviously some various sensors and equipment here.
Grillo and Tomola are here to bring us the information we need to make crucial decisions about our lives and the world we live in. It's important to understand who these journalists are and how they work, the places they take us, and the people we meet.
This is some kind of defenses, so you couldn't just drill up from here into the United States.
The United States begins there. En esta línea aquí. Now, I'm in Mexico. This is the line separating the two countries. And now I can step back into the United States. Just like that. Increíble. Increíble.
Mexico is where I started my career, right out of graduate school. It was here that I began working as a freelance foreign correspondent 40 years ago. And I'm looking for Gerardo Carrillo, a friend and colleague from my days of covering Mexico and Central America for United Press International and Newsweek magazine. Like me, Carrillo started out as a freelancer. He later founded the video unit for the Associated Press in Mexico. Today, he's a critical link between freelancers like myself and stories on the ground. Carrillo can cover this market as a one-man band, or what I call a backpack journalist, because of technology. Instead of the larger, more expensive cameras he used to lug around in the 1980s, he now uses gear that is smaller, lighter, and cheaper. and he can do the job himself without assistance.
I'm going to take us a little bit forward. If you have questions, stop me. We can stop this, or you can ask me now. But that's pretty much the introduction to the film, and I'm making an important point here about Carrillo. He's a really talented, young man. As I say in the film, well, you'll see. We'll see.
Like this, at the very, very bottom level, news and information gathering.
It's not just technology that's changed here, so has Mexico. The country has mutated from a generally peaceful place to a violent, lethal place where el narco, or drug traffickers, are engaged in what some call an insurgency. Experts say at least 175,000 people have died in Mexico's decade-old drug war. Another 28,000 have disappeared. Caught in the jaws of this carnage are the journalists who cover it. Today, Mexico is one of the worst countries in the world to be a journalist. More than 100 journalists have been murdered here since the year 2000. 25 others have disappeared and are presumed dead. Of all the journalists killed in Mexico's drug war, none is a foreigner. All are Mexican. Perhaps the narcos understand that killing a foreign journalist might be bad for business. Whenever things get too hot for foreign journalists like me, we can run to the airport, whip out a foreign passport, and head home. But Mexican journalists can't do that. They already are home. On a laptop computer, Carrillo edits his video of this women's rights march before transmitting the material to the Associated Press in Washington. This was unthinkable when I first came to this country in 1977. As I watch Carrillo toil away at his craft, I'm reminded how much freelancers like me depend on people like him. For the work they do at the grassroots level of journalism, for the guidance they provide about navigating their country and their people.
You know, one of the reasons why people like Carrillo can do what he does, and one of the reasons I was able to make this film with only 2 people, we had, you know, my student had, it looks like a little, you know, a still camera. Just like it was a mirrorless, you know, DSLR, right? And he had 2 lenses, and he had a microphone on top of it. You know, when I was in the field, you had to have a $50,000 Betacam with like this big, and you had to have $1 million editing suite to edit the stuff that you generated in the field. He can do this. He shoots the stuff with this little, you know, Carrillo has a little camera. Matt, my student, had this little DSLR, and we wired me up with one microphone, you know, with a little, and I put the receiver here in my pocket, and put one on whatever subject we were following, and that was it. And we have a documentary, yes.
Isn't part of this advancement also part of the problem? Because you don't have the filter of objectivity or subjectivity or reality.
It's part of the problem of keeping these people employed. Carrillo right now is doing the job of there used to be a cameraman, a sound man, an editor. You know, you had 3 or 4 people doing one job. He's doing the same job with one person with a camera that cost a fraction of what the equipment cost before. But he still has editors. You know, he's got editors in Washington, D.C. when he sends the stuff out there. So he can make some decisions in the field of what to shoot, what not to include in the stuff that he sends. But, you know, people have editors in Washington, D.C., and they're checking people like Carrillo because, you know, number one, they want to make sure he's not hiding something in Mexico, protecting himself or protecting political leaders or under pressure from anybody. So, but you're right, it creates problems. I'm not sure that balanced reporting is one of them. It creates safety problems because, you know, when I go out, you know, I normally work just by myself because as a photographer, I like to work by myself as opposed to having a bunch of people around me. You know, journalism, I never liked it. But when he goes out there alone, especially in the countryside or in a place in conflict, you don't have anybody to bounce your ideas off of. You don't have anybody who's looking to your back and saying, wait a minute, this is too dangerous, don't go. You make these decisions by yourself, and that can be really dangerous. Go ahead, you want to make
I was just going to say, we have a forum coming up in about 3 months based on a very high quality Israeli company who does defense for journalists, how to protect yourself, how to choose what elements you go out and research and write on, how to protect yourself in the field and afterwards. And it's amazing because who thought 20 years ago that the journalists themselves were going to be vulnerable? We at this organization 20 years ago were teaching people maybe in warfare how to protect themselves, but not in daily life.
No, I mean, and believe me, students here, and this is one of the topics of our discussion at this meeting today, this big conference. You know, we have to prepare these students not to go to El Salvador, not to go to Mexico, not to go to Iraq and Afghanistan, to go to Ohio, to go to Pittsburgh, to go to Florida, because they're under attack online and in the streets by people who don't agree with them. And they're following the lead, unfortunately, of the people in Washington, D.C. are calling them fake news and enemies of the people. You have the president of this country attacking the media, you know.
Sorry, it could be a bit controversial. What I'm asking you is it just a ploy for him, for the president to say that after 4 years, he's probably couldn't care less.
Of course he doesn't care.
You know, so it's probably just a ploy for him to say that he's an enemy of the people, to keep this flock.
Keep the base alive.
I think.
Am I right? I don't know.
I
think so. I believe in truth and I believe in facts.
Exactly.
Some people don't.
I think, in my opinion, that was the best strategy that Trump. If you look at during the campaign between Trump and Hillary campaign spent millions of dollars on ads. Trump only spent a couple of dollars because he was from day one. That was the part of the strategy that he deployed to attack the media.
Well, I mean, you have to take a step back and ask yourself, what are the incentives of media organizations? If they're all for-profit organizations, then their incentive is just like that of Facebook. They have to sell ads. So Trump is good copy, so they gave him a lot of free publicity because that brought him attention and that brought him ads. So, you know, when our very learned friend is talking about New York Times buying and selling stories, then I would never do that for a very simple reason, because I don't think people in the New York Times are qualified to judge which story in India should be covered. As an editor-in-chief from India, and that's why I created a non-profit. Because when it comes to a story from the Arab world, I'm not qualified. When it comes to a story from Latin America, I need someone who knows the country. So I think we've got to examine, take a step back and say, what are the big structures as well? Are the incentives aligned? Are the checks and balances aligned? Because it's much deeper than that.
You had a point, sir.
What is your opinion? You mentioned that it's a one-person job, the correspondent.
It can be.
It can be, yeah. I have a professor colleague who told the future will be not the easy camera, not the DSLR, but the telephone. What is your opinion about that?
3 years ago, I went to Ecuador to do a story about the indigenous people's spiritual relationship with the forest of the Amazon, and how they were fighting against the oil companies and the timber companies that wanted to invade their land. And it was rainy season in the Amazon, and I did not want to, carry a $5,000 camera in one of these, because I knew we were going to be going up and down rivers, and they had these dugout canoes that were basically logs, and they dig them out, and sometimes they flip over. So I took one of those.
And you good quality telephone.
Absolutely.
Absolutely the same.
It's my iPhone 6. Yeah, it's fine.
Am I right?
Yeah, it's high definition now. Now it's 4K.
It's okay.
I'm a
HD.
correspondent, I film everything with the phone.
Yeah.
Or I'll ask them mobile. So
I bought a $50 little microphone like this. I plug it into the side.
it's like a super tiny.
My colleague is a professor at the New York University.
Yeah.
Like $200.
Yeah, absolutely. I've done it. You can go to what it's called when the forest weeps, when the bosque llora. It's got like 8,000 views on Univision.
And in India, this is a film festival for the phone-made films.
There's a new iPhone out, I think, iPhone 11,
Yeah,
that has actually lenses on it. Lenses.
iPhone 11.
Yeah, yeah.
I have one question if we want to take a little bit the conversation back to your documentary. What about the options of funding this work?
Of what?
Funding.
Funding is,
Yes.
yeah.
Because this has expenses, this has your own eye. Let us know a little bit about the process of what
Okay.
is happening in case that someone wants to do something similar. And what are the obstacles that you may be facing in terms of the fundraising?
I went out on a limb when I did this. I had students working with me. My wife worked with me. We did an Indiegogo campaign. We pulled together like $25,000. My student went with me to Mexico for free. I didn't pay him because he wanted the experience. He wanted to work with me. He wanted to learn. He's a smart guy. So I didn't pay him for that, but I paid him very, very well for editing the film. And he's going to be with me on Saturday when we show this thing at the museum in Washington, D.C. We have the packed house. We have a waiting list for people to get in. So he's become kind of a mini star because of his association with this film. But I still went into the hole. I mean, you can go to Mexico, just two people, and do a decent job like we did here. But it's a different story if you want to go to Nairobi, if you want to go to Bangkok, or if you want to go to Rio, or if you want to go to Istanbul. So the next, I'm applying for grants now, and I'm looking for, a funder, someone who's really. We're going to show this thing on Saturday in the museum in Washington, D.C. It's an institution. If you have a good arm, you could throw a rock, really good arm, and hit Capitol Hill. Okay, that's how close it is to the center of power in this country. And the museum is an institution which everybody loves. And it's closing its doors forever on December 31st. Closing.
Yeah,
Closing.
it's closing.
It's closing.
Yeah.
And I'm
And
sorry.
it's being bought by, yeah,
No money.
no money. And it's being bought by SAIS, School of Advanced International Studies, the mafia I told you about, the higher education mafia, John Hopkins. So all the money is with Harvard and this, and they are like country clubs. So it's interesting. That
It's a real shame.
It's a shame. It's a tragedy.
So the long and short of it is, if anybody has like about $240,000 to fund my next project, I'll leave you my card, okay? I'll leave you my cell phone number. You can call me anytime you want.
I just wanted to come back to Mexico.
Okay.
I just read a book called El Sicario, which is the autobiography of
Sicario, yeah.
El Sicario, and I think it was Room 9, which I haven't been able to read. I haven't been able to see the documentary. I think it's called Room 9.
I haven't seen it.
Anyway, El Sicario.
Yeah, El Sicario.
He says,
It's an assassin. That's an assassin.
yes, for a cartel.
Yeah.
He says that the young men go into the police academy and they learn how to shoot, they learn how to do everything, and for very little money every week, and the cartel pays them a lot more. And when they graduate, they're expected to go right into the cartel, and they even use police cars for kidnapping. They know when to not have any. But
So
what
what happened?
hope is there for a country when you have a police force that no one can trust,
That's
when they're
$64,000
wearing
question.
uniforms to kidnap and torture?
Yep.
Yep. What do you see Mexico being in 10 years?
It's going to take a lot more dead people for the country to come to.
The question is,
To
how
wake
did we
up.
get here? How did we get here so quickly? Because if you look back 15, 20 years ago, there was some kind of structure or scaffolding that prohibited these most egregious. What did we lose, and how did we get here, and what can we retrieve?
I don't know, El Chapo was saying, the president of Mexico wanted $25 million and he only gave him 20. And that caused not a ripple of interest in Mexico and among any one Mexican that I know. It
Yes.
sort of met with a shrug. We know that.
Well, you saw what happened a few weeks ago when they tried to arrest Chapo's son.
Yes, I did.
And
They couldn't do it.
I mean, the narcos came out of the woodwork and they had a firefight with the police and
And they have better weapons.
Yeah. And all the weapons come from here.
What do you see the future of the country of Mexico?
I don't think it's very bright. I mean, you have a system of it's like a caste system there, where you have a few kind of like mestizo, mixed blood people on top, and you have the masses are kept down, in poverty. And as long as that system exists, you're going to have violence. That's the root of it. That's the root of it. And this is burned into the culture. I mean, that's how Spaniards became successful in this country. They avoided taxes, they cheated the crown, and then they declared independence. It's a tough one. It's a tough one. This is a really talented young woman who is doing a story on parteras, which is midwives. I'll show you part of this. And I think it's because women now are joining the forces of foreign correspondence like never before. I mean, when I first started out, 40 years ago, I mean, there were a couple of women around, but they had to struggle tooth and nail to get ahead. Especially in countries where there was conflict. Editors didn't want to send a near conflict because you can't do it because you're a girl, this and that. So they really had a tough time. Now things are changing, and they've gained a lot of terrain in terms of their profession.
And what do you want to commit to in your life and kind of compromises from it?
If Gerardo Carrillo is part of the technology revolution that's changing the tools of our craft, Janet Jarman is part of the gender revolution that's changing the faces of our craft. She started out as a photographer for the Miami Herald, but left to take a master's degree, then became a freelancer. Like so many photojournalists enabled by technology, she began to work in video. Foreign correspondence once was a field dominated by white, middle, and upper class men. That's no longer the case. Guerrero is long considered one of Mexico's most violent states. It's especially known for violence against women, who often show up dead in the street, or they just disappear. So working here, sometimes at night, with an all-female team on a story about women, really put me on edge.
And I don't want you to get the idea that this is all, sad stuff, dark news. Some people have made the very, very conscious decision to work as freelancers, and there's a young couple that have made this decision. I'll show them to you now. It's a rather touching part of the film.
And Dominic Bronco embody the new breed of freelance foreign correspondent, perhaps more than any others I met on this trip to Mexico. They are bound together in part by their sense of independence and entrepreneurship. They are free spirits. She's worked as a Mexico City-based photojournalist for 2 years. He's been here for 7. Dominic found his place as a photojournalist in Mexico's northern city of Juarez, where the drug war raged and where thousands were killed. I've covered conflict on and off since 1979, and I've seen some hard things, but even I found some of his work tough to look at. I first met Dominic during his presentation at the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting in Washington, D.C. Megan used to work here, and Dominic has won grant money here. The Pulitzer Center is one of the nonprofits supporting freelancers overseas. personify the idealistic freelancers of today who have chosen lifestyles of purpose and meaning despite hardship and risk.
This is a pretty tenuous. I mean, a lot of people who think that being freelancers anywhere in the world is a tenuous existence. I mean, a lot of people just couldn't do this. They need, a 9 to 5. They need a steady paycheck every month or every 2 weeks. How do you negotiate that? I mean, is that an important consideration for you guys?
So both of us grew up in households where our parents worked for themselves, which I think is interesting because I never wanted to work for someone. Really, I was raised with that mindset. I think Megan's the same way.
Dominic was raised in South Texas, where his father owns a construction company. Megan's from New Jersey. Her mother is a commercial interior designer.
It's difficult. There's a lot of competition, there's a lot of great people, and you have to be better and smarter to survive. And so I think as hard as you would have to work to maintain that, in my mind, it's nice that you're doing it for yourself every day. To make it in this career, you have to work your ass off, and we work really, really hard.
How do you negotiate that? And you're separated. Often, sometimes, whatever. And so you have to go out alone. How do you, as a couple, how does it work?
We've never done anything else. Like, our whole relationship has been that. Our whole relationship, actually, the coolest thing is, now we live together, so we get to come home to the same place, which we work really hard to make happy and safe and peaceful and have things that we both love in it. And so I think we've just always been used to it. And I mean, you just sort of develop a way of communicating with each other. Would you say that that's right? Like, when you're apart, that's the beautiful thing about dating a photographer is they understand when I'm like, cannot talk right now, but I'm fine and I'm safe and it's fine, but I can't talk to you right now. We're in the middle of something, but I love you and I'll talk to you tonight when I get back to the hotel.
Yeah, I think we give each other the space to check out when we're gone. And then when you're here, you're kind of expected to be here.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a constant balance though. I mean, it's nothing perfect.
It's not easy.
No, it's not easy.
Can you talk about that a little bit? What do you give up and what do you get in return?
I think you give up stability. I mean, being a freelancer, you have this really flexible life, but you also have this life that can change really fast. And I think the word my family suffers is the wrong way to put that, but I think my family misses me, and I know I miss my family a lot.
The instability kind of bothers you a bit, but not enough to stop doing it.
Not enough to stop. And they're proud of me, and I'm really proud of myself, and I think it's worth it. And they're super supportive. Like, my 87-year-old grandmother is like, you go girl, so.
It's a demanding job because there is no stability, right? The only stability that her and I have is each other.
What do you get in return for this stability?
You get,
the world?
No, you get total freedom. At the same time, it depends on where you are in your career, right? So you go through different stages as a freelancer. There's moments, like any business where things are going really well, and then with that comes a certain amount of stability. If you have a good base of savings, then you have the ability to take control of your agenda, and that's why living cheaply is so important. I think if you're keeping your overhead low, then that gives you the ability to save cash for moments when you do want to spend time with your family, or you do need to go on a vacation, or you do get sick, because that's the other thing is you get sick and you got to work.
When I saw this note on the refrigerator door, something resonated deep inside me. Perhaps because I've been through this test of fire, the challenges of living abroad, away from family, under constant stress. It says, I love you to the moon and back down to the bottom of the sea. I had the best month with you. I feel so lucky. Thank you for being the kind, generous soul you are. I know things are hard right now. I promise they will get better. I will be here to support you always. Have a great trip. See you on the 23rd. I love you.
So I'm going to take you to the end of the film now, because we're pretty close to getting up to time limits. And I'm going to take you back to young Grillo. And so we have a couple of other characters here. We go back to the border. This guy's an old colleague of mine. He's been around for a long, long time. He's still a freelancer. And there was an earthquake in September of last year, and he covered the earthquake, the aftermath of the earthquake. And lots of people were killed. This is another one of my friends. He and his wife, he had married a young woman in Mexico, and they have a child, a daughter, and he really got beat up, and his wife was actually killed. That's her. So, I mean, you know, people who live in these countries, I mean, how many of you are concerned about an earthquake, you know, waking up on that, or a flood, or guys with weapons fighting in the street? These people have to live, depending on where they do live, with stuff that we never consider, or disease, or, you know, it's just. Anyway, so I do a long interview with Yon here. He talks about these narcos and the empires that they've created for themselves. And there's an important scene here at the end of the film where we go back out to the border, and you know, I talked to Yon one more time, and we wrap up the film. So
patrolling this area, looking after this area, because, you know, this is their jurisdiction, because they think if they do run into stuff, it can often be quite heavily armed guys. You consider these kind of things,
that's the border,
are pretty attractive to smugglers, these kind of places. I mean, that's the United States right there. Yeah. And there's Mexico right here. Now it's pretty easy to jump. I mean, we could very easily go to the United States.
Thousands of undocumented migrants cross this border each year. They flee poverty and drug gangs in their own countries. Most bring only clothes on their back and hope in their heart for a new life in the United States.
We've been here a little over 24 hours.
Yeah.
And in that time frame, you have gone out at night to look at the fence, to look around Nogales. You have interviewed the mayor of this city. We have come out here to the countryside. We've done a couple of other things, you know, running around and working, you know, pretty much 24 hours a day. Do you think that people understand what real journalists do? What's your perception of what they perceive?
What I want to understand from this particular, I'm thinking about the story itself. So, I mean, all of these stories are complicated, and I want to show different sides. This is not just simple. I mean, there is an issue with, you know, the United States border with undocumented workers, with cartels, with smugglers. These are real issues. But what I want to try and get across, a lot of this is the real human stories. So when you go to these shelters and you see people who are human beings, who have had tough lives, they live tough lives, you know, and you imagine what they go through. And if people just coming out of incarceration, being deported and trying to send money back to their family to feed their children. These are the human stories. That whatever you feel about these issues, they're real issues. They're real issues with undocumented workers in the workforce, with wages, with trade unions, with social services, with hospitals. These are real issues to people. But we need to feel the humanity of these stories, you know, the humanity of these people in this. Now I try and do these things from my heart and do good work.
Regardless of how we feel about the legality or the humanity of it all, this long steel line separates more than just two nations. It separates husbands from wives, children from parents, brothers from sisters. As young Grillo and I walk along this frontier, I wonder if it's not these freelancers who help set us the truth about Mexico and the rest of the world, then who?
I saw a story by her.
She's gotten a lot of assignments from the New York Times.
Right, because I saw her on a story. I thought she herself was the
Could be.
voice. She was the voice, I thought.
Yeah, could be.